So I begin the lectures now on Michael Walzer's great book, a fundamental book about the ethics of war, or military ethics, however you want to call it, called Just and Unjust Wars. And the subtitle is A Moral Argument with Historical Illustrations. And that's important, that subtitle, historical illustrations. Walzer, what I'm going to talk about in this video is just the preface, and I think it's a good thing to concentrate on the preface. It's always a good thing to concentrate on the preface of a book, because that's usually, and the dark parts at the back. So don't neglect the two ends of a book. Why? Because that's usually where an author reveals quite a bit about what he or she is up to. And in that sense, you can get a good idea of the orientation of the book from a larger perspective. And so in the preface, now there's several editions. I'm using the 4th edition, and there's prefaces to various editions. So I'm not looking at the preface to the 4th edition. I'm looking at the preface to the original work itself. So we would now say like the 1st edition. So in the preface, he gives us a good idea of where he's coming from. Now, it's a moral argument, yeah, but it's historically illustrated. And Walzer says right at the beginning, he didn't come to military ethics by thinking about war in general, thinking about questions like, okay, what is exactly a war? What do we mean by war? In other words, kind of what we'd say a philosophical, semantic investigation of the concept of war. That's great. Clausewitz and a lot of other people have done that. Clausewitz wrote a lot on this to try and ascertain what exactly, quote unquote, a war is conceptually, and then would unpack a variety of arguments about it. Walzer's not doing that. He says very clearly that he didn't come to this study through this abstract perspective. He came through it through a very concrete perspective, namely the Vietnam War. He was concerned about the issues of the time that were surrounding that war. So we're not going to go into that part of Walzer, but it's good to know that he's coming at it from quite a concrete perspective, not the abstract philosophical perspective. And so let's just kind of look at this preface. It's only a couple pages long, and it does pay off to read it carefully. So on page 22, he says, look, we do argue about war. So war, we can treat it as an object that we can discuss rationally. So when you start thinking about war in those terms, that it can be discussed rationally, we can talk about it with respect to ethics, whatever we mean by ethics. We'll get to that in a second, and he has a particular understanding, or at least of what he wants to do when we talk about ethics of war. But it's a rational, we're not saying that it's a good thing or whatever, but we're saying it's something that we can rationally discuss. It's not something in the sense that, as maybe like a pacifist might say, where, look, there's just no real rational discussion about war. It's just an intrinsically evil thing, and it should never be allowed in any ways. And it really doesn't make any sense to talk about war in rational or even in ethical terms, because it's just wrong. So he's not saying that, right? He's saying that it is something we can rationally talk about. However, he also is quick to say that he's not expounding the basics of morality in this. And he talks about this in a number of places in this little preface here. So he wants to talk about, as he says, so he's not expounding the basics of morality. So on page 23, he says, I'm not expounding morality from the ground up, right? Were I to begin with the foundations, I would probably never get beyond them. And if you read a lot of philosophical work on ethics, there's reams of literature on the foundations of ethics. That's not what Walzer's doing here. He says, I am by no means sure what the foundations even are, right? So there's lots of debate on what the foundations would be for ethics. The substructure of the ethical world, these foundations, is a matter of deep and apparently unending controversy. Meanwhile, we are living in the superstructure. So he's just saying, look, with all due respect to philosophy, that's not what I'm doing. I'm looking at it from where we live. We live in the superstructure. The building is large, and then he uses standard in philosophy to use a building metaphor. Descartes uses it, foundations, etc. You build upon foundations, whatnot. And Walzer is using it too. But anyways, aside from the building metaphor, he says this is a book of what he calls practical morality. The study of judgments and justifications in the real world moves us closer, perhaps, to the most profound questions of philosophy. That's true, right? And it's long been said that something like war, when you examine it, that pushes you, forces you to look at the deepest questions of ethics. Now, but it does not require, he says, a direct encounter with those fundamental questions of ethics, like what is the foundations of ethics? He doesn't think you need to do that. So he said, for the moment at least, practical morality is detached from its foundations, and we must act as if that separation were possible, since it is an actual condition of moral life. So one of the things that we have to be careful about when we read Walzer is sometimes he will make distinctions that he doesn't necessarily think are absolute and radical. They're often practical distinctions. We make practical distinctions all the time. Scientists make practical distinctions all the time without assuming they're radical distinctions. Give you a simple example. If you're a scientist and you're studying a little ecosystem, let's say you're studying like a little pond or whatever, you make certain kinds of distinctions or abstractions. You consider certain things kind of as if they were separate. You're not asserting that they're completely separate, but in order to study them, you make certain kinds of abstractions and distinctions. Walzer's doing that too. He's trying to abstract from, all the deep questions of ethics and look at it from just where we live in terms of practicality. So keep that in mind. Sometimes people will read him like he's making, absolute claims about ethics or whatnot, and I don't think he is. And I think he's pretty clear here that he's saying that he's not. So he says this is a book of practical ethics, or practical morality, if you like. Well, what is practical morality? Well, we'll get into this a little bit, of course, more as we go through the book. But he says the method of it, so he's already said something about how he's going to do ethics. Namely, he's not doing the deep dive into the subterranean sort of element of the foundations of ethics. Not doing that. Rather, he says the method is casuistic, or it's what used to be called casuistry. Now, casuistry is a very old approach to ethics. It's hundreds and hundreds of years old, but it is different than the direction that many philosophers took. Most philosophers, following the ancient Greeks, tended to take the foundational approach to ethics. And today, philosophers will often take those foundational approaches, even if they don't admit that they're really doing so. So when we get to some of the philosophers that are reacting to Walzer, they're taking a much more foundational approach than he is. And by foundational approach, what I mean is like they're talking about, really strict moral principles that are grounded, and they're all kind of almost an absolutist framework. So you'll see certain philosophers, when they react to Walzer, they'll say, well, it stands to reason that, and then something will follow from it. When people are talking like that, when people are saying, well, reason dictates or reason says, that should make you at least alert to the fact, okay, they're taking kind of a foundationalist type position, right? Walzer, again, is not really doing that. He is taking more of a practical one, and the method, he says, is casuistry. Okay, so I said that casuistry kind of differs from the tradition in philosophy, which is more grounded in this foundational approach, although not exclusively. There's lots of philosophers who don't ground it like that. But in any case, a lot of them do. And so what does he mean by casuistry? Well, casuistry has a long, rich, and very interesting tradition. It's largely the product of shall we say, a lot of reasoning that was done by Jesuit scholars and priests, several hundred years ago. And it was reasoning it's the same kind of reasoning that's often done in common law, reasoning by cases, right? And you instead of looking for absolute principles, you look at precedent, what people have done, and the way that people have talked. You build up this sort of kind of paradigm of the way that we actually speak about ethics. So this is kind of how we do it. And then when you encounter new issues or new cases, you compare those back with the old ones and see how close they are or far they are. And you make your judgments by those proximity type arguments. And casuistry works along those lines. It's more complex than that, but we'll see how Walzer does it when we actually dig in, when he gives us his historical illustrations and then tries to pull some principles out of what people were actually saying and doing. So the fact that we argue about war is important, and how we argue about war is going to be important. So it's more like a sociological type of approach. It is normative because Walzer is not just saying, oh, well, here's how we talk, and there's all those people talk or whatever. And we're not talking really about anything like right and wrong. We're just describing how people talk. No, he does go beyond that. But he doesn't go and dig in and say, well, here's the reason dictates and this is how it must be or whatnot. He stays away from that, and we'll see how he does it, because you really have to dig into a book like this. As I said, the preface just gives you a general orientation. So think of Walzer as looking at giving the argument as from historical examples that we do argue about war. We're not, and we argue about it in the everyday kind of way that we argue about ethics, not the way philosophers do, but we do build up what eventually he calls the moral paradigm of war, or a certain way of talking about war, which seems to be fairly consistent throughout history. We'll see him talk about that even more. He also says that one of his main goals is the exposure of hypocrisy, right? And when people try to dodge issues about the ethics of war or try to get around these kinds of things. And Walzer is saying, no, we do think about war. We think about it very critically. We're very concerned. We talk about it as if it were amenable to rationality, logic, reason, and ethical thinking. It's not just some sort of absurd thing that we do. Even though it's got, immoral sides and all kinds of terrible things about it. But it's something that we can think about it. So, and at the end of all this, he also says he's working within some kind of framework of human rights, which I'll just usually abbreviate as HR with a little subscript S standing for human rights. And so, well, that's kind of interesting. What does he mean by that? How does that all fit together with a casuistic kind of reasoning? So you'll have to stay tuned for that because, as I said, this is just an overview, but it does give you a good idea, in contrast to many of the philosophers reacting to him, that Walzer is looking at war through the lens of how we normally throughout history, and he thinks there's a great continuity of how we actually have ethically or argued about the ethics of war.